Hello, all you dreamers, optimists, and junior tomorrownauts. Welcome back to the Tomorrowland Times podcast, the unofficial home for fans of Disney's 2015 Tomorrowland movie, its prequel novel Before Tomorrowland, and the alternate reality game that introduced us to its fictional universe all the way back in 2013, The Optimist. I'm Hastin.
And I'm Nick. Today we're continuing our limited series on the show, the Before Tomorrowland Book Club, celebrating the 10th anniversary of the prequel novel written by Jeff Jensen and Jonathan Case. Last week we covered the prologue and the attached Further Beyond comic, so now it's finally time for us to crack open part 1 of the book's trilogy of sections, comprising chapters 1 through 9, which runs just over 100 pages.
But before we dive into that, let's flip open our MFD and check the Plus Ultra mailbag for any messages from our listeners.
Beep, boop, beep, beep, boop, boop, boop. Oh, Hastin, look at that. We got a new message. Let's take a look. We have a message from Randy. He sent us an email to press@tomorrowlandtimes.com. Anyone in the future that would like us to respond to your question, go ahead and email us there. Randy said hi, and thank you both for this new podcast series. Hastin, he then went along to say that when we were going through the prologue and we were describing, the chair that Henry sits in as a kid to sort of do the simulation of the Plus Ultra preview, he was reminded of a few things throughout science fiction history. And a few of those things were the chair in the movie Contact, which I remember very well. That's a formative science fiction movie for a lot of people. Also, there was another one I think you'll respond to. He was reminded of the chair from the planetarium in the game Myst. Were you getting those vibes as well?
Absolutely. I mean, that same where the panel comes over and then you plug in and then all the stars rotate to show you that respective area of the gallery to find images. No spoilers. On a 25-year-old game, 30-year-old game. Totally the same kind of vibes, that fully immersive, kind of transformative experience.
And the last one he mentioned, which I think is one we all wish was not relegated to the land of lost theme park attractions, Horizons. In that same sense, where at the end of Horizons, you could choose the future that you wanted to see, and the ride would take you there and show you some form of simulation, just like Henry was seeing. Now, there was a second note that Randy wrote in here with, which I think is very interesting. When we were talking about, ultimately, the airport depicted in Jonathan Case's illustration, the hangar in that prologue, was not one at that time that Hughes would have had on the west side of Los Angeles. And we were sort of saying what we thought the visual inspiration for it was. He throws us another one here. Cloverfield Airport, now Santa Monica Airport. If you look at the historical photos of that he sent along, there is definitely a resemblance. I got to hand it to you, Randy.
Absolutely. No, Randy, you nailed it. I think this is exactly what Case was going for with this drawing. I mean, it looks almost picture perfect to what was on the drawing.
Not to mention that there is some Amelia Earhart history tied into that, which obviously we're going to start diving into with this first chapter here. Randy ends by saying, again, I very much appreciate your continued dedication to the promise of Tomorrowland. We need dreamers more than ever right now. Randy, we couldn't agree with you more, and I can't thank you enough for listening along and writing in. Leaving us off with Amelia Earhart, Hastin, I'd say it's time to literally crack this book open to part 1, chapter 1, and let's go through it. Let's start here just before we've got the epigraph page.
Absolutely. The following story takes place between July 2nd and July 4th of 1939 in the greater New York City area. Many of the characters and events described here are well known to history. A few of them are not.
A few of them are not. This is just setting the stage, folks. This is getting you in the mood of historical fiction. And I love that it's immediately setting the expectation of, look, there are 3 parts of this book, and they each take place on a single day from different characters' perspectives. That's a really neat way to structure a book. And it's a really compressed timeline. It's not some epic that's going to take place across time. This is 3 days in New York where all of these different historical and fictional events coincided, which is just a really neat concession for a book like this.
And I gotta say, so I was literally just in New York about 3 weeks ago for work. We ended, of course, just like as we will discover, at the top of the Empire State Building, which is where this beautiful view behind me comes from to our visual listeners. It was a delight. It was absolutely a delight revisiting the book and revisiting this first part, because so much of it still not only still sort of echoes that, that sort of feeling today, but being able to put yourself there, it's like, oh yeah, these are real locations that they used. These are real things that they referenced. There's a lot of real history in here. And so it was just a delight to come back off of that trip, crack open this book. And, I went with my roommate and, we walked the same exact steps that they walked. It was fantastic. And so it just gave me such an awesome appreciation for the book and the detail that was put into it and everything else, because it's great.
You're not wrong about that. There is a lot of accuracy to be found in the pages of this historical fiction. And that turns us back from March of 2025 all the way back to, it says right here, part one. It welcomes us to part one, July 2, 1939. And thus begins chapter one with the subtitle, In Which the Brackets Take Manhattan. It's not the Muppets this time, folks. It's the Brackets. And we're starting at Penn Station. Mile High overview of the story covered in this chapter is as follows. In exchange for tickets to a Yankees game, Lee agrees to take Clara into the city where a bespectacled, funny-looking man in a silver suit gives her a Plus Ultra Viewmaster, bringing you vistas from further beyond for free. It shows her a view of a glowing field of wheat and an alternate look at a completed Wardenclyffe on a hill. The strange man solicits ideas for what the utopia in the pictures ought to be called. Clara offers Graceland, and Lee, in his infinite wisdom, Betterburg. Hastin, I really enjoyed this opening chapter. We've gone from a kid and his father to a different kid and his mother in a very different situation. And the mom already has her own little pin moment like Casey does, in the movie. This time, it's the pair of, they call it stereographs, but we know it's a Viewmaster. Plus Ultra must have invented the Viewmaster as one of their many holdings, a la, I always remember back to when the Men in Black revealed that they held the patent on microwaves. Those secret societies, they've got to fund themselves somehow, and the Viewmaster is not a bad way to do it.
Well, and of course, the stereoscope Viewmaster from the Carousel of Progress scene, which was in the Carousel of Progress all the way back in the day. Loved that. Hopefully that was a nod to that as well, because that's a great little connection there.
And this is someone they encounter at this what we, as looking at it from the outside, if you already know the film, it's immediately obvious to the reader in a modern sense that this person she's talking to is some kind of recruitment robot for Plus Ultra. Plus Ultra just can't stop with these recruitment robots. And it's on the ground floor. They're just in a train station in New York. And here's someone with a little table handing out Viewmasters. That's a great invitation to mystery if I've ever heard one.
I loved the detail, too, that they were coming up on the early train from Edison, which is Edison, New Jersey, which was renamed to Edison, New Jersey after Thomas Edison, who we know was in Plus Ultra, did a lot of his early experimental work at Menlo Park. And so you've already got that kind of like Lee and Clara connection to Plus Ultra before they even know it.
No, you're right. I never thought about that. This is the sort of foreshadowing. Their destinies were locked into Plus Ultra from the very beginning. I never noticed that detail. Good eye there. Other little character details that I love, I always love, as in previous episodes, talking about character names and the inspirations for them. The young man who's helping his mother is named Lee Brackett, which is, phonetically the same as Lee Brackett, Leigh, the famous science fiction author who a lot of Star Wars fans out there, I'll shout one out for you, wrote the first draft of The Empire Strikes Back. I always like to pull that one out when we talk about Lee Brackett. And that's a detail that won't go unnoticed in future chapters. The predicament of these two is a very interesting, dramatic way to start this. You've got the young man and you've got his mother who's sick with cancer. We immediately know this information. And their personalities, I always thought was interesting. The exact opposite dynamic of Casey and Frank. You've got the elder woman who is the optimist, and the younger man who's become a bit cantankerous just by the circumstances of life. So you've already got this immediate thematic connection to the movie, which I really appreciated as a way to get us started off in the story here. Now, we should dig in a little bit to some of our recurring segments, like, I don't know, maybe Location Station.
The hover rail will be arriving in 1 minute. The hover rail will be...
We're pulling into that location station This is going to be a quick one for location station. Penn Station.
It's a station.
It's a real station. You want to see that crystal clock? Go to Penn Station. At least I think you can see it.
I have seen it.
There you go. Go look at the crystal clock. And when you look at the crystal clock, you'll think of Lee. You'll think of Clara. You'll be off on our own adventure. This concludes Location Station. The last thing I'll say about Chapter 1. There are really no meaningful changes from the advanced reader copy, just little copy edits here and there, other than the title header changed. It was originally in which Lee Brackett arrives at the Big Apple with his mother, Clara. The new one, the final one, is a little bit more concise than that, and it just brings them together. Mother, son are the Bracketts. We're up to Chapter 2, in which we meet a scientist of mad repute and the wretched Nazis who loathe him. Somewhere off the coast of Long Island, former Plus Ultra member turned Nazi mad scientist Rotwang searches for a sunken steam freighter containing one of his lost creations, an automaton capable of holding human consciousness. They find the shipwreck cut open with precision before being attacked by an unseen assailant whose voice over the radio is described as a sick, high soprano, not maybe the voice we were listening to. We're getting into the political intrigue here. The Nazis show up in Chapter 2, Hastin.
Nazis off the coast of New York.
Bad news, Hastin. There's nothing good that can come of this. Another interesting note on this chapter, as we get into the whole intrigue of the mad scientist, the crazy Austrian Rotwang, the character that he is under, the German that wants the technology that he's developing. This is the character that changes the most between the advanced reader copy and the final version. We have a little bit of a different intro paragraph I'm going to read here, just from Rotwang's point of view. If there was anything that Werner Rotwang hated more than being told no, it was imperfection. His father once said it was because of Rotwang's intimate familiarity with crookedness, not in the moral or sinful sense, although his parents believed that about him too due to his zealous belief in science, but because he had been born with a curved spine that made every step he took through life a painful one. Rotwang learned to deal with the agony, but never made peace with a universe that allowed disease and death dominion over everything or permitted degrading superstition and stupidity to flourish. Creation was a deeply flawed piece of work, and he refused to be ruled or ruined by bad design. With that alternate intro, you kind of get a little bit of a parallel. You know, you have a couple characters in different corners of the story dealing with physical ailments. You have a hero with Clara, and you have a villain with Rotwang, which is very interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting that this would get cut out of the final copy, because I think it sets him up a little bit better as well, rather than just this scientist gone mad from Plus Ultra. It gives him a little bit of personal motivation. We do get a little bit more personal motivation in the next couple of chapters, though.
That's a lot of these edits. I don't want anyone to think we're saying the earlier version was better.
No.
What we're going to find here is that a lot of these edits were made almost to sort of delay the gratification of preserving some of that stuff for later. Like you said, we get a sense of this later. You don't have to give people the full meal up front. And so a lot of these little copy edits are just like, let's give them as little as possible to understand the context of the story and save some of the character revelations for when the characters are actually doing stuff. That's good writing, and I agree with this edit. But as I alluded to earlier, this patron, Hugo Lohmann, the sadistic German warrior that we have in the final book, was a totally different characterization originally, and I think they made an excellent choice in the edit. The original character was named Bowfinger, and there was a boogeyman quality to this guy, and in the sense of a Navy scientist who, in that version of it, we would have had a mad scientist working for an even madder scientist. And so you just got two mad scientists. So I actually prefer this dynamic of the mad scientist working for this militaristic sadist who just wants to live forever. So we'll get a lot more of that down the line, but I think that dynamic is a lot more interesting. But it was pretty unique to see this alternate version where it's just this stack of mad scientists all trying to live forever. One other little alternate passage from the advanced reader copy that I thought was worthy of note, just because you and I love Plus Ultra lore. When Rotwang is considering this creation, he calls it the HS1, this consciousness holding automaton. The final book says it's worthy of the artisans of myth, which is a shorter version of saying what the original text in this chapter was, which was worthy of the mythic blacksmith he had read about as a dreamy child, the crippled god of metallurgy and fire, Hephaestus. And this idea that this pursuit of practical immortality was against the plus ultra code of ethics. They originally specifically cited like rules in the group's charter against pseudoscience and Promethean heresies. So I thought maybe they thought it was doubling up too much of these references to arcane, mythology and other things. But I thought it was interesting to associate. First, you associate Rochwang with a similarly crippled god of metallurgy, and you've also got this other idea of categorizing this rule of plus ultra as no Promethean shenanigans. All right, you've been cast out. They sort of just generally say that there were these, rules of ethics that he went against without specifically going into them, which is probably the safer thing to do. This is chapter 2. We can't get into this stuff too early. There are still things to learn as we go through here. So excellent edits all around. This chapter 2 changed a lot and it's a lot leaner now. We get into the details of the backstory through other characters' perspectives. So it's probably best not to give it to the antagonist. Let some of the heroes reveal some of this backstory when we go into their perspectives later, which later a little bit is this next chapter, chapter 3, in which Henry Stevens returns to the world of the future, Coney Island. So yeah, Henry Stevens. We remember this name from the prologue. This is the little kid, but what does this have to do with the little kid? Because here's a little summary of what we get in this chapter. The HS-1 surfaces on the shore of Coney Island, after this whole altercation that he gets into under the sea with
On the
Rothwang and
Watts, yes.
all the Nazis. His internal robotic monologue reveals that his consciousness is Henry Stevens. The machine that they were looking for in the last chapter is the consciousness of this kid that we got to know through the prologue 13 years earlier or so, give or take. He visits the dilapidated remains of the World of the Future exhibit he had visited in Santa Monica, now in a trash pile in Plus Ultra's dumping ground in Coney Island. After accidentally activating a discarded butler robot who goes crazy and starts saying stuff, he blows the place up with sticky bombs. And we get the sense that this kid, now robot, automaton, is out for revenge. There's a sense of revenge going on here. We still don't know why exactly, but getting to see through his eyes. I love these chapters that are from Henry's robot perspective. I love all of the sort of Terminator-esque file systems, where we get the little filing directories down the way and all that. Any other fun details you picked out in this one, Jason?
A couple things. I loved this idea of, as he grew older, the exhibit grew smaller. That like it had been 7 years and 6 years since he had last seen it.
Yes.
And so this idea of like, he had grown in size as a now very young adult, because this would have made him like 17, 18. And like, this idea of it just seemed like something. I love the description here of like the dilapidated building and just kind of falling apart and whatever else. Total allusions to what sort of happened in the second half of Tomorrowland, the film, with what actually happened to the future or this alternate universe. So I loved that. The whole idea of the naive boy who's like in love with futurism, but then it goes south on him, I think is like so much of even
Baked in.
the baked in experience, and even is sort of the baked in experience of like any kid growing up. I mean, how many generations have we been told that there's going to be flying cars in 30 to 40 years and they're still not? How many generations have we been told, a public transit system's going to get built and it hasn't and whatever else. And so I just love this idea of it not only ruined him, but he encountered the same thing that he would have that same sort of pessimism, even as Plus Ultra still existed and maybe thrived. And he was he became a direct creation of it, that he was still struggling with that sort of common growth that we all experience.
I love that you point that out because we often talk about Tomorrowland and the myth of Tomorrowland as this very modern idea of we used to dream of the future and now we don't. It feels very timely. But you're making a great point, which is there's also an aspect of these stories, both the movie and this book, that appeals to this universal thing. No matter when you live, no matter where you are, this idea of coming from naivety into adulthood and trying not to become jaded. That doesn't just apply to futurism and all these things about Tomorrowland. There is a timeless quality, and that's what I think makes it great. I also love that you pointed out his perspective on everything seeming smaller. This is something that books can give you that movies can't. This real internal monologue. And so whenever I see people suggest, man, I wish Before Tomorrowland had been a limited series on Disney Plus, it's like, that's great. I would love a limited Disney Plus series from the universe of Tomorrowland. I prefer it to be an original story. But the reason I like this book is all the things it does that only a book can do. It puts us in Henry's head. There's not a great way to dramatize that observation that you made. So love this so much. Last couple things I want to say. We got to talk about the plus ultra nerd stuff. Him coming upon the wooden fence and it saying quarter minus entertainment. The idea of plus ultra being these great innovators of the future, maybe not the best at branding, but I do love the idea of this secret cover story, the opposite of plus ultra, quarter minus. Fantastic. No notes. Love that 100%. And I remember that being a big point of discussion with us when this first came out, the delight. And I think you and I even may have incorporated the quarter minus branding when we were doing some little jokes online about the Toxicosmos
Right, yeah.
franchise. Yeah. The last, tying into the movie just like there, the last sort of movie observation I made while I was reading this is there's just something about Tomorrowland and a character coming up to a dilapidated place and being assaulted by a dog who's stopped on a chain. Because we have the holographic dog in the movie, and then we have a very real dog here with an artificial person. So again, so many of these moments are inverse shadow versions of what we're getting in the movie. And I just love those little echoes that ripple across the whole thing. So yeah, short, sweet chapter to the point, and it really sets the stage for, okay, there's a lot of different players here.
I think it also sets a great stage of, okay, they tried and did this recruiting thing in the past, and now here we are again in New York trying it again.
Yeah, there's a cycle here. And as we know a little bit coming from the perspective of the fandom of the film, no matter what happens at this 1939 era of the World's Fair, it's still not going to go as well because they had to try it again in 64. We're kind of going in with this knowledge to a certain degree. That leads us into chapter 4, in which Clara and Lee take a bus and meet her people, Midtown Manhattan. This chapter tells us about Lee and Claire. They check into their hotel, and as she unpacks, we learn the reason that she's there. Haston, Clara is a big old nerd.
She's like us.
She's just like us. And she's going to Worldcon, the real first world science fiction convention. When they get there, his mom kind of shows her portfolio around the exhibitor's room. And while she's doing that, Lee passes a table with a placard that reads, "Comics, Thrill and Intrigue, the incredible story of Plus Ultra. Could this be your world of tomorrow?" The table is manned by the same weirdo from the train station. Look, think, win. Name this place, win prizes. We learn the bronze man's name is Faustus, and he assigns a Further Beyond comic to Lee, and he has a cold handshake. Okay, so we're getting closer to this mystery. The audience, I think, is now supposed to know, okay, this is another automaton here. And if you're coming at this knowing the film, the sunglasses in the comic are assigned to a specific person, just like we see Athena do for Casey with her hair sample for the pin experience. So this is the prototype pin experience. Here we go. We're into it. This is Tomorrowland stuff here.
The bus ride, of course, she's sketching the cityscape that is around her, the semi futuristic cityscape, because so much growth and development and everything else happened in New York around this time. I couldn't help but feel like there was also this, connection to like not just the World's Fair sort of being the city of the future, but the city itself and how much growth it had experienced in the last 10 to 20 years that New York had experienced. It felt like the city of the future at the time, too.
You're totally on point, and that's a little bit of foreshadowing for something we're going to talk about later, because we're going to talk a little bit about Fritz Lang. And there's a famous story about Fritz Lang being inspired to make the movie Metropolis. The Metropolis of science fiction was inspired just by Fritz Lang coming from Germany and flying over New York and saying, I didn't know this was possible for humanity to create. So you're totally right. New York looked like Tomorrowland to people at this time. around this era, maybe a decade before. This was absolutely this futuristic thing. And, look, I'm just becoming the guy tooting the movie's horn, of course, but having Clara sit and sketch a cityscape on a bus, you have a direct parallel scene in Tomorrowland where Casey's on the Greyhound bus sketching a city of Tomorrowland in her notebook. So there are these ways, perhaps not literal plot causality things, but there are these thematic touch points that connect the book and the movie. And it just delights me now looking back, because when we first read this book, we didn't know exactly what was going to be in the movie. We had a good idea, but now looking back, it's really been, honestly, this was the biggest surprise for me rereading this again, was how many little tiny grace notes there were like that. And it's just been a real joy to discover that. And I mean, obviously, I have personal echoes that I see in there as well. When they were describing all the nerds in New York that they see, and they literally say one of them has a vacuum strapped to his back. I'm like, young Frank Walker, his jetpack's made out of 2 Electrolux vacuums. You've got all that stuff
Yeah.
in there. It's just great.
One also super really fun thing is that I loved the note that they made while they're in the bus, passing by the Empire State Building, saying, they were going to put a blimp station at the top of it. That's the truth. This is one of like the major things that they bring up when you actually go up to the 102nd floor. They're like, well, they had no real plans for this. They just wanted it a certain height, and they knew they were going to do a big radio mast, and they knew they were going to do a big thing. So they built this tiny observation deck at the very top eventually that an elevator, that a small like 2 to 3 person elevator goes to. But it was designed originally like, well, maybe we'll put like a blimp station or something up there. And that's referenced in there. So I thought that was a really fun nod to like a real thing, a real historic thing in the books. So super cool.
Hastin, you've brought us into everyone's second favorite segment, fact versus fiction.
And how would you convince them? Data? Facts? Good luck.
Yes.
Okay, so you just totally did it. Empire State Building was going to have this airship thing. That'll start us off. Some other details that we get in this thing. First mention, Lou Gehrig. They walk past this newspaper stand that has a newspaper with the headline, Lou Gehrig to address fans at 4th of July retirement game. This was a real thing that occurred. They really are trying to place this in real history. I will say I did look it up. That exact headline was not on any newspapers that we have a record of. Perhaps it was a different newspaper we don't have a record of, but I'll say real thing, fictional headline. I'm still going to give that 100% fact, 0% fiction. The other one that I love that's just delicious, and we'll go into this just a little bit because it really gets juicy in the later chapters, is this escapist slash elitist subculture wars with the pamphlet that they get handed by one of the fans at the Worldcon, and this idea of there being a protest within the fandom. Totally real thing. This actually happened at Worldcon. And what I always like to reflect on with these things is that fandom has not changed one iota. The internal division that we see, we think it's like an internet thing. We think it's something that is unique to our modern age. But debates between fans, kind of knockdown, drag out ideological disagreements, these are tale as old as time. Literally, we couldn't even have one sci-fi convention without this happening. It was the first one, and there was this internal debate, and now Lee and Clara have found themselves in the middle of a little bit of fan wars. And I just think that's great, context setting, and also the perfect thematic touch to talk about, look, Plus Ultra, they don't agree on everything either.
So another great fact or fiction thing is that in this chapter, when his mom is looking at tables, there's a book that gets handed to him called The Secret People. And it's a real book. And what I loved about it is that I thought they might have changed something here, because he says, I tell ya, it's all set in the future world of 1964, which is obviously when the fair took place. But the book actually takes place in 1964 that was written in the 30s, which I thought was really, really fun and clever, and a great nod to both the fair and the movie and everything else. So that was great.
And beyond, I'll continue on your track you've set here. Books that connect Tomorrowland, the movie, the book, and the 1952 box. We've got another mention here, Hastin.
Amazing Stories.
Amazing Stories magazine, which features directly in the 1952 box, which led to the inspiration for the film. This is the issue. I have it in my hands. The jetpack emblazoned man on the cover of Amazing Stories, edited by Hugo Gernsbach, a name which will not only come up later in Before Tomorrowland, would become the namesake of one of the great characters in the film, played by Keegan-Michael Key.
I loved when Lee was talking to Faustus and he goes, "It's just, why put all this thought and energy into something so useless? No offense," right?
Yeah,
And it
yeah,
was
yeah.
just like, how how many times as people who have loved something have we heard that in our lives from the fandom that we love and the things that we want to create and the things that we do create and whatever else. And so his, like, Lee's kind of like pure, pessimism in this moment is just so strong. This is his mom's thing. He has no interest. He thinks everything they're doing is a waste of time. And the trajectory that he takes is great, in like discovering what he actually really likes and what it is and how maybe for him it's not a big waste of time.
She had to bribe him with baseball tickets just to get him into the damn city. That he couldn't be less interested. There's no question. One thing I like to do, look, we got a chapter where Clara is showing off her portfolio of art. We've got to dig into our portfolio of art in this book because not every chapter has an illustration by Jonathan Case, but this chapter does. It's a picture of Clara with her portfolio. She's got Lee following behind her, and there's a big arrow sign above them that points to the Billy Rose Aquacade. Now, in the background, we also see someone getting an autograph from, I couldn't really read it very well. I thought it said Reginald D, and then it's cut off. I actually couldn't find any reference to anyone at Worldcon that was a Reginald D. If anyone out there knows any science fiction authors or illustrators that would have been working around this time named Reginald, write us in and we'll correct this one with this incomplete information. But now, Haston, did you look at all into the Billy Rose Aquacade?
I have not. What is the Billy Rose Aquacade?
The Billy Rose Aquacade was a real thing, but it was a real thing at the World's Fair. So the fact that there is a sign for it in this illustration almost makes me wonder, was this something that was being advertised at Worldcon as taking place at the World's Fair? Because with my sense of geography, I do not believe that Worldcon was being held next to the fairgrounds for the World's Fair. So it was of the period for sure, but not necessarily something that I can find no record of being at Worldcon. But Haston, this discussion of physical maps and locations leads us directly to our favorite segment. Haston, which station are we pulling into?
We're back at the location station.
The hover rail will be arriving in 1 minute. The hover rail.
My God. I mean, obviously, this chapter is just filled with minor references to things you can see throughout New York. Those are pretty minor mentions. New York Public Library, St. Patrick's Cathedral, Macy's. Everyone loves a good classic Macy's. But Worldcon's the big one. And they name it. It's Caravan Hall. And Caravan Hall was, in fact, where Worldcon 1 took place. There's an address for it. There's been some interesting research into this. The location is sadly no longer there. But if you want to go down to 110 East 59th Street, New York, you'll see where it was. And if you do go to look around, there actually is something that was there at the time, not necessarily directly part of Worldcon, but there is the founded in 1925, the Argosy bookstore, which still stands. It's this multi-storied bookstore, and they sell antiquarian books. I'd say if you're doing your New York Tomorrowland tour, you absolutely have to put the Argosy bookstore as a stop on this tour because it is of this era. And honestly, looking at Google Street View anyway, I'm pretty sure it's the only thing in that area that is still there from this time period.
So when they're on the bus and they're passing the Empire State Building on the Avenue of the Americas, there was a reference that they passed between like 37th Street where they were staying. Well, on that bus tour, they would have passed directly through what became Nikola Tesla Corner at the corner of 6th Avenue and West 40th Street. So I thought that was another really fun thing as well. There's a small plaque there, and we got pictures of it last time right near the public park. And so just another great reference to yet another Plus Ultra, Nikola Tesla, Tomorrowland connection. So that's great.
Man, we can really count on you to pick out all of those marginalias that apply specifically to the founders of Plus Ultra. They're hiding in the gaps, and Haston is the one that finds them. Let's see what secrets he can unlock in Chapter 5, in which the Aviatrix gets a clue. Coney Island. Plus Ultra Security Chief Amelia Earhart and Fritz Duquesne investigate the explosion at the scrapyard that we learned about last time. Fritz presses her about her year on the other side. They discover the butler robot's head left over from the explosion, and they access the memory chip to reveal footage which shows a hulking silhouette that we know is Henry, but that she only recognizes from Howland's Island Beach the day that her plane was hit and crashed through the jump point to the other dimension. She boards her seaplane and ditches Duquesne, knowing only that Plus Ultra is under attack and on the eve of their biggest endeavor. Now, the safe bet would be to pull every Faustus unit off the streets and cancel the operation in which Tesla had invested his entire life. But she says she's come to care much for him and for his dream. I love this little bit. This chapter is short, sweet, to the point. It introduces my favorite little character dynamic. I love all this stuff about Amelia Earhart and Tesla. It is a little bit, there's an age gap there, but there's clear affection fictionally between these two people who in real life very likely never met with each other.
I loved here the reference to these Model Bs have memory chips. So they created these robots for the show that in some capacity were real robots and were Model B. I love that.
I also love that. It just a little bit of texture, a little bit of language for, there's these internal numbering systems and lettering systems for these generations of robots. We don't get to know exactly which generation all the robots we meet are, but the idea that there is this hierarchy, and that Butler one was a very early one. Obviously, we're dealing with historical figures here. Two people who actually lived, in which case I can only say, it's time to say fact versus fiction.
And how would you convince them? Data? Facts? Good luck.
This one is pretty quick. We know to history very famously, Amelia Earhart went missing in 1937. That's 2 years before this particular book takes place. And there is a mention, Duquesne offers her some beech nut chewing gum, which seems like this, she says no to it. Oh, I thought that was your favorite. This is a cheeky mention to something, Hastin. Do you know this little historical fact about Amelia Earhart?
I do not.
You can find some great shots of Amelia flying a plane that is emblazoned with the beech nut chewing gum logo. So it was one of her sponsorships. You know, like athletes have sponsorships. She, as this famous aviatrix, had a real world sponsorship with beech nut chewing gum. Casey Newton had her favorite. She had Beeman's. And now Amelia has beech nut. But I do love this dynamic that it's like, he thinks it's her favorite, but it's like, look, if you actually are if you have a sponsorship with someone, it does not mean it's your favorite. She's probably sick to death of that stuff. She doesn't want to be chewing beech nut chewing gum. Get real. We're getting off to a bad start with this guy. But in the fact versus fiction, we got to talk about Fritz Duquesne, real dude, big game hunter, journalist.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he has a few other things about him that history knows, but we're not going to say those now because they come up later. Let's just say people who know who Fritz Duquesne is when they read this book will not be surprised by certain things that happen later. But that's not now. That's not now. Let's get out of fact versus fiction and into our next favorite, location station.
The hover rail will be arriving in 1 minute. The hover rail.
Now, I'm going to have to make this bumper shorter, folks. I'm subjecting you all to this bumper over and over and over again. But these are the things we do. We got some stuff here. Hastin, let's talk about Howland Island. Howland Island.
Where Amelia planned to land.
She planned to land, but never landed. And I wish I could say that this was an easy one to visit. This is just an island out in the middle of nowhere. But if you intrepid listeners do find a way out there is something erected on the site called Earhart Light. It was a lighthouse. It's a little worse for wear now, but there's still a few bricks left. And I'd say if you're a die-hard Amelia Earhart fan, you got to do something. You got to charter a plane. You do whatever it takes. Swim from somewhere. I don't know what you've got to do. Get yourself to Howland Island, which gets a nice little flashback mention here.
There's one location that you shouldn't visit. Well, I guess you can if you want to. So in this chapter, when Amelia is talking into her MFD and she gives the location of the Plus Ultra scrapyard, she says 40.5, 77 north, 74 west. And if you look at that actual location, it is a street corner with a park and a ton of apartment buildings today, like a big tall housing project kind of thing. But it is an actual location that those coordinates do line up to an actual location on Coney Island.
Blowing my mind here. I mean, Coney Island, imminently visitable. There's something visitable for you. But the fact that they went to the trouble of putting in actual coordinates, fantastic. This is the level of detail we appreciate from our world building. From one island to another, we got to talk about 2 chapters in a row with art by Jonathan Case. We're lucky here, man. We got a nice action shot here of Amelia Earhart behind the yoke in a cockpit. And in the arc, this was in the middle of the chapter, but they moved it to the end for the final version, which I think is the right place. You want these little chapter arts to send you off into the next one. So yeah, this is our first really solid look at the Amelia Earhart of this book. And speaking of the advanced reader copy, we do have a few little extra things in the same way of Rotwang, things they would later save for chapters down the line. We have right up front. Haston, would you like to read this little passage that Amelia and her introduction has in the arc that's not in the final version?
It was nice to know she had not been forgotten. It had been exactly 2 years to the day that Amelia Earhart was declared missing and likely deceased after her plane went down by accident over the Pacific. The truth was slightly more complicated. She and her crew had been shot down while testing one of Tesla's more esoteric theories regarding the potential for high-speed air travel. The attacker never found. The motive, a mystery. Even Plus Ultra had thought she was dead, with the sole exception of Tesla, who never stopped looking for her. Her year abroad, so to speak, was a more complicated story still, and one she herself did not like to dwell upon. Duquesne didn't even know the facts of the matter until last week, though it wasn't for a lack of trying. He was an intelligence man, after all. Her response, "I don't believe in angels, do you?" was originally framed as something she remembered from Tesla telling her when he pitched her his plan for the reveal.
Yeah, so you get a little bit extra on the whole Tesla Earhart dynamic in the advanced reader copy. And I will admit, a little bit of my shipping these two is probably based on the fact that I read the advanced reader copy first, and I just got it lodged into my head that there was this interesting friendship slash potentially something more intimate than that. Obviously, this is not the point of this book, but it's always fun to think about these things, especially when both halves of the ship are historical figures. Chapter 6, in which Rotwang receives a new commission somewhere off the coast of New York. In this chapter, here's what we get. Tortured by his Nazi masters for the attack by his creation, Rotwang considers his past history with Plus Ultra and his manipulation of Henry as he is cleaned and prepared to visit Herr Lohman in his room-sized hyperbaric chamber. There, he reviews the information provided by Plus Ultra's mole, including a flyer for their presence at Worldcon, which is surely the rogue HS-1's target. Lohman asks what Rotwang needs to deliver Plus Ultra, and he responds, "A radio tower. A tall radio tower." Now, this points to only one thing, of course. We've already talked about it, Haston. The Empire State Building, of course, but we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Absolutely.
We're not there yet. We're not there yet. Plus Ultra and the bad guys both love really tall radio towers. We get it, folks. It's all about radio towers. Another great little detail we get in here that obviously, going back to my love of Metropolis and Fritz Lang, this is where we learn that Fritz Lang was a Plus Ultra member. And we get a specific date. Rotwang joined in 1928. And the character in the movie was named after this very real, fictional in our story, but, the real character Rotwang in Metropolis named after this mad scientist, directly inspired because he collaborated with Fritz Lang and Plus Ultra during what they describe as the Great Robot Uprising of 1929. I think that's a whole nother book right there, Haston. I think we got before Tomorrowland about the Great Robot Uprising of 1929.
Yeah, their own Black Friday.
And we've got a few residual changes from the switch. When it went from Blofeld to Lohman, originally, we learn a little bit about this backstory between Rotwang and Henry, the consciousness being put into the HS-1. Rotwang was making him believe that Plus Ultra's ultimate goal was to turn all mankind into mechanical animals. In the final version, Rotwang tells Henry that they forced him to do the experiment just to see what happens as careless futurists obsessed with speed, ease, power, and efficiency, which is honestly perhaps a little bit of an easier lie to believe based on what we know of Plus Ultra. I like that there's maybe some authenticity to the complaint. It gives a slightly better motivation for Henry if what he believes, even if it is ultimately a lie of manipulation on Rotwang's part, it kind of does ring a little bit true with what Plus Ultra is up to. In both of these versions, Rotwang says that one day they will take their revenge on Plus Ultra. But in the final book, we actually get a little additional information that describes this later period of training. So after they've run away from Plus Ultra, underneath Loman, to sort of characterize the villain of Loman, who forced Rotwang to keep Henry constantly active. So no downtime, no rest time, even if Rotwang is flagging that this might make this guy snap. And ultimately, Henry does snap. And so this was an early indicator of, look, there's dissent between these Nazis. Just as there is internal debate in Plus Ultra, there's internal debate among these crazy Nazis that want to live forever. Oh, these villains, like David Nix himself, always wanting to live forever. Oh, there was another little linguistic hiccup that I enjoyed, a little change from the advanced reader copy to the final, and a humanizing one that I appreciated. When these pieces refer to the HS1, originally they were saying it, but in the final version, from Watchwang's perspective, they now say he. So I like that some of these changes were about making their connection a little bit more authentic, not necessarily all just arch villain, but actually having some kind of relationship between the two, even if it is based on lies. I think that's a much better writing choice across the board.
I liked this concept of Cartesianism. Well, I didn't like it. That's clearly why he went crazy. But this belief that the mind and body are separate but connected and not wholly integrated. The idea that he became obsessed with this radical Cartesianism.
The mind-body problem, it wouldn't be good sci-fi unless we were calling up some of the great thought experiments through history. And, you know, this is a young adult book, but we're name-dropping Rene Descartes right in there. That's the Jeff Jensen, Jonathan Case way. We're bringing it to you. Philosophy of the mind, philosophy of the body, folks. That's why we love Before Tomorrowland. A little less heavy is Chapter 7, in which a comic book is read and geeks fight. Straight to the point, the chapter heading tells you exactly what's in here. We're back at Worldcon. Lee can't stop thinking about his strange interaction with the Faustus unit until he overhears his mom's portfolio reviewer suggesting she needs to use a male pseudonym for her artistic work. Lee unloads on the guy to Clara's dismay. She wanted a job and this kid was getting in her way. She begins to not feel well. I can't blame her. And on their way out of the hall, they find themselves in the middle of a big fandom debate. You know, the escalation of the version we were introduced to with the pamphlets in the previous chapter. Now, Clara attempts to stand up and play mediator here. A house divided cannot stand. She invokes the solidarity. The science fiction fans, look, people hate geeks enough. We at least need to band together. But the minute she stops talking, they all go back to fighting anyway. She doesn't gain any traction among the warring factions. And then they step out onto the sidewalk, and Lee finds Clara collapsed on the floor. This is a good cliffhanger because if your one job is taking care of your sick mom in New York and you let her collapse on the floor, Lee is not crushing it. That's all I got to say. Lee is not crushing it. Hastin, what do you got for Chapter 7?
Love the detail. I mean, there's so much, there's so much personal, I think, experience that you can tell that Jeff Jensen had with this from the first chapter about what his wife was going through at that time and the very specific description of how Lee was taking care of her, to this idea that she was so friendly in public and yet she wouldn't tell some random soul about her cancer. Like, it felt very personal to me reading this of like, oh, this is Jeff's experience too, like out here on the page. And so it just gives it a really, really, that to me gave it a really big kind of personal note. I love Lee reading the comic book and kind of browsing through it and then being like, it feels like propaganda, like, secret society pulling the strings,
It's understandable, man. The ways of Plus Ultra are mysterious. They are looking for a particular type of recruit, perhaps a little bit different in this era than they were later in time, but still in the same general vein there. I do love all those details. One thing we forgot to talk about previously, obviously, the comic book is a very central thing throughout all of these chapters. They went ahead and described the answer to a question that we had when we were just talking about the comic book on its own, which is, what are these glasses made out of? And they literally, they call it, they say they're made out of bamboo, or at least they feel like they could be bamboo. Obviously, Plus Ultra is probably using some ultra thin, futuristic, disposable aluminum, whatever, I don't know, but he says that they feel like bamboo glasses. So I did love that little tactile detail, especially because these glasses are going to continue to play such a key role.
I also loved the area where where they're talking about her name and there's like, this is cute, but again, do you have any something more wasteland scene, more dystopia, more drama, like totally playing into that whole, like, even at this time, that was becoming a popular part of, of science fiction, not just necessarily this sort of optimistic future, and hence the argument and the debate that I love being described as the dapper geeks on the stairway yelling at each other. Like, you could just envision it.
I also wonder, and if we ever get a chance to sit down with Jonathan Case and ask him about this, you're talking about the personal details that Jeff is adding. I also am getting the sense that Jonathan, as an artist, is probably injecting a lot of personal memories of portfolio reviews at conventions and the type of comments that you get from editors showing your work to someone. And it's just this very vulnerable, awkward moment in the middle of a busy convention hall. I would be willing to bet a lot of those details are coming from Jonathan Case. And it all just plays so authentically. As someone who's been to a lot of conventions, this feels really authentic. And I like that they're injecting some of the modern sense of what a convention is into the original Worldcon, because it obviously had some of those aspects, but you want authors to use their personal experiences when they make these things feel more real. And I just love all those details. I love how they're depicted here.
Which some of those details takes us into fact versus fiction.
And how would you convince them? Data, facts. Good luck.
Let's go double bumper. Fact versus fiction and location station at the same time.
The
How
hover
would you
rail will
convince
be
them?
arriving
Data,
in 1
facts.
minute. The hover
Good luck.
The Futurians being banned from Worldcon. Absolutely a real thing. There absolutely were these pamphlets being passed around, this internal debate. The way that they described the Futurians in the book, absolutely accurate to what they were. You have some of these fan testimonies that you can read online about being there and what kind of the mood was like. And no one could agree on anything. The fact that this all really was going on at this time and all of these historical events really did kind of coexist, it makes absolutely obvious why this story is set when it is, because this is the perfect answer to the question, why are we not envisioning the future? No one can agree on what the future looks like, even on the fan level, not even what the fake fiction future should look like. Getting back into that location station vibe, we knew that they were staying at a hotel in the previous chapter, but this chapter gives us the actual name of it. They say we need to get back to Sloan House. You look up Sloan House. Yeah, Sloan House. The William Sloan House was a YMCA. This was somewhere cheap that travelers could stay. This is a real thing. It's not a YMCA anymore, I don't think, but this was real.
Yeah, it's now apartments that are managed. 356 West 34th Street.
Just go take a look. Don't bother any of the current residents. But if you do, tell them it's because of Before Tomorrowland. Maybe they'll buy a copy. We can get this thing charting on Amazon. One thing I'd like to say, in some of these chapters, you'll notice there are absolutely zero changes from the advanced reader copy. And those ones tend to be the Worldcon Clara Lee stuff.
I walked right by this building multiple times a couple of weeks ago and had no idea, because it's right there near Madison Square Garden, near the Hudson River Tunnel. And yeah, I walked by it multiple times a couple weeks ago. No idea. Awesome.
The world of tomorrow is always hiding beneath your feet, Hastin.
It's true.
And we'll learn a little bit more about that in Chapter 8, in which Henry Stevens ventures into enemy territory, New York City. Now, Hastin, this is the biggest chapter we're covering here, so I'm going to do my best to attempt to summarize this as quickly as humanly possible, but this is a big chapter. We go through a lot of stuff, so strap in, folks. I'll give us our summary, and then we'll dive in and discuss our favorite little aspects of it. Henry has a nightmare about first waking up in his new mechanical body, then of Rotwang and his lies about Plus Ultra. Then he remembers flying with Amelia when he was 14. He asks her about Tomorrowland, revealing that the name for the other dimension was his idea. He remembers being on the run with Rotwang, who tells him that this consciousness holding uranium in his core could also be activated as a weapon. On their secret atoll where they're hiding, Rotwang and Henry are responsible for shooting down Amelia's plane in order to attain the processing power of a robot on board. Now, in a New York City tenement, Henry charges his body and remembers the day Rotwang's true intentions were revealed to him and the horror of his fate to be memory wiped so that Loman can take over his body. Oh, I would run away too if I found out all this nonsense. He searches Plus Ultra's real estate holdings to find that they own Worldcon's host location, Caravan Hall. He attempts to use his robot nose to scan for Plus Ultra leader's signature BO. I'm going to pause right here. I described it this way, but I want people to know I'm not making this up. There is a patches in this book that describes the internal Terminator-like process of Henry scanning for the body odor of Plus Ultra's leaders. This is nuts. This is the stuff we love with this. Moving on. In that process of looking, he happens upon an alleyway argument between a Faustus unit and a Plus Ultra agent named Purvis, who is incensed that only 4 people had been recruited rather than the hundreds that they wanted for this big dress rehearsal in a few days. Inside Worldcon, Henry overhears an argument about the Plus Ultra glasses between Forey Ackerman and Ray Bradbury. Forey claims that he heard Orson Welles' narration as he looked through the glasses. Henry decides to impersonate a Plus Ultra officer and confiscates the comic and glasses. But when they're touched by a hand other than the assigned recruit, it bursts into flames, seemingly giving Bradbury the idea for Fahrenheit 451. Henry then spots Lee helping Clara into a cab from the sidewalk and begins to follow them to their hotel. Another cliffhanger. That's what I love when I turn these chapters and go from different perspectives. There's a lot in this one, Hastin. This one is chock full of awesome, awesome stuff.
I love the visual of the scene of all of them like about to go on this tour with their, with the comic book that they've been handed with their glasses. And then he comes in and he says, no, we're not doing this instead. And I also loved obviously you have Hugo Gerns back in that group, who we find out is an honorary member of Plus Ultra for working on his amazing stories.
Oh, no. Hastin, it's burning in my hand.
And then I love this little detail about, Henry had been one of those innocents dreaming of Mars and the moon on the carpeted floor of his mother's house in Los Angeles long before his dreams crumbled. Plus Ultra Vision had crumbled too. And this idea of this seemingly genre that Plus Ultra created to activate these science fiction fans was now turning into and I love this description, this mere escapist pulp with sex, violence, and retrograde values, supported by a subculture of competing enthusiasts obsessed with ridiculous, meaningless details. I mean, just
beautiful.
The mere lens of where I feel like we are at now, even considering that this book was written 10 years ago. And we were not, I think, at the sci-fi discourse 10 years ago where we are today. It's like, this just feels like exactly holding up a mirror to what today's sci-fi is massively facing. And so just what a great detail and how it's written and just, what you could connect with.
No, you're absolutely right. It's beautifully done. It's beautifully represented, and it feels so authentic to the experience of being a fan, existing in it. And these things are a tale as old as time. You're so right. But let's go ahead and adopt some of those baser qualities of fandom and get into the minutia. They're fighting about details. We're not going to fight about details. We're going to celebrate some details in fact versus fiction.
And how would you convince them? Data, facts. Good luck.
All right. It doesn't get much more basic than this, Hastin. The Terminator display on Henry's thing says it's 89 degrees. That's hot. It's hot in New York City. And it was hot in New York City. Was it that hot? It was almost that hot. The posted high on July 2nd, 1939 was 82 degrees.
Something I've learned from the city being there multiple times is that when you're walking those streets, it feels way hotter than it is. And this is true in both winter and summer. So maybe his early plus ultra internal temperature detection said it was 89 degrees.
Right. It's like how on our phones now, it'll say feels like. It'll say it's 82, but it feels like 89. That's exactly what it is. I think you're completely right about that. You already talked about Hugo Gernsbach, real dude, amazing stories editor, honorary plus ultra member, fantastic. So glad that he's represented here. We got another real person though, and this one is pulled right out of the schedule because we have the full schedule for Worldcon 1. William S. Sikora, he did give a presentation at Worldcon, just like they mentioned in this chapter, on this correct day during the afternoon session, which is listed as being 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. The other thing that happens in that programming block, not mentioned in the book, but tying directly into stuff we've already talked about, there was a screening of Metropolis during Worldcon during the same programming block. So it all, even if it's not mentioned in the book, all this stuff ties together. It's fantastic. I would be remiss not to mention Forey Ackerman and Myrtle Douglas. Forey Ackerman is 100% the origin of modern fandom and sort of what we think of as fandom through the magazines that he did. Absolute legend in that space. And he did, in fact, wear a costume in the way described in the book. And we actually do have a picture of it. You can go look up a picture of Forey Ackerman and Myrtle Douglas in costume at the first Worldcon.
One of my favorite details in this chapter is Faustus is talking to the leader about recruiting and whatever happens. And on his MFD, it was the person, replying to the Faustus robot from Plus Ultra saying, it was supposed to be hundreds of people. We prepped this crap for months, years, if you count all the seed material. And what do we have? 5? No, what'd you say? 4 civilians for a $20 billion dress rehearsal happening in 2 days? It's insane. And I love this idea of this duality of Plus Ultra's recruiting is also so small and so fixed. And we see this in the film, right? And one box of pins that Athena has somehow takes 50 years or however long it is to roll out.
1939, 1964, 1984, 3 attempts to roll this out over time.
Even from 1984 to, let's say, 2014, it's like she hands out like half a dozen to a dozen pins that fit in that box. Clearly the recruiting concept that they keep trying doesn't work. So I love this call out of, they've got all these comics, they've got all these things that they've made, they've got all these plans. They're at the first convention, and yet the Faustus robot could only really find 4 to 5 people that they feel are actually worthy of being recruited. And Lee is one of them.
The imagery in that chapter of all the boxes of leftover comics being consumed in the fire, and then just this snake of ash left behind. Amazing imagery, unique. You could actually absolutely picture it in your mind's eye. And you bring up an interesting point, Hastin, that we often don't talk about the film aspect of Casey. Why is Casey sort of remarkable in the movie? By the time of the 2014 that exists in the fiction of Tomorrowland, why does that percentage change behind her when she talks to Frank? We forget about this. We think it's just our world. It is a fictional version of our world. And in this fictional version of our world, she's literally the last person left who is capable of believing that averting apocalypse is possible. Obviously, in the real world, there's probably many people who do. But in this version of the fiction, statistically speaking, she is the last one. And they happened to find each other, and that finding of each other brought it together. So it's totally on track with what you're saying here. They planned for hundreds, and they found 4. Now, if they had tried a little longer, they probably could have found a few more, but still, it speaks to the predicament of the world of this fiction.
And I love this. We get this backstory about Henry, too, where Plus Ultra programmed its Faustus robots with specific criteria to determine worthy candidates, generally from groups of engineers, mechanics, and physics. Almost 10 years ago, one, a Faustus robot, had interviewed Henry and determined him fit to serve. He had been an 11-year-old boy. that was unprecedented at the time, and it had outraged many of the senior leadership. Every day, Henry had wished their dissent had prevailed. So this idea of, at that time, it's like, no kid. We don't want kids. Kids shouldn't be able to qualify for this and whatever else. We flash forward 30 years later, and like,
Yep.
they're recruiting what feels like, nothing but kids and mixed people and whatever else. So I love, again, that sort of like, you get that sort of preview of, no, it was ridiculous in 39 to recruit kids. And then it's like, no, they recruited Frank at a very young age from the fair.
You're right. That's a total other pre-echo leading into the film of just like the change in mentality almost. Not to say, look, I mean, Nick's, come on. He's also representing some of the qualities here that we have reflected in the villains and maybe even the rot within Plus Ultra. It's just nice to see these ideas being laid down so early.
During the Sikora presentation, the William Sikora presentation, I love this. Henry is standing there watching this presentation, and he says, whether we believe in science fiction as existing purely for entertainment or not, let us not permit ourselves to be labeled as save the world crackpots, and let us take the messages of the authors of science fiction working together hand in hand with the progressive new fandom, strive to make the fantasies of science fiction become reality. And I love Henry's plus ultra propaganda, thought Henry. He had no file on Sikora. Just another deluded fan who bought Plus Ultra's lies. Another dreamer seduced by the idea of a technological wonderland, a crackpot. And boy, did that feel like our experience, at least for me, felt like our experience, like right after like New York Comic Con. We're all set. We've had our big presentation. We're ready for the next version of this, amazing technological story to come to us before the film, and it never happens. And it's like, I felt like a crackpot in that moment, and so yet another fun thing that sort of reflects the book on personal feelings with this movie and being a fan of it and what we experienced 10 years ago in New York.
Henry's internal monologue that you just read there, very much the 1939 equivalent of when people call us shills.
Yeah, 100%.
Chapter 8, chock full of great stuff. So many wonderful details, so many resonances with both ourselves and the film. And honestly, Hastin, this has been such a blast. We're now in the final chapter, chapter 9, in which the evil Dr. Rotwang meets the Mole Man.
The day is almost over.
The day is almost over. Mouth of the Hudson River. Here's what we cover in this short chapter. Rotwang and Lohman emerge from their submarine, the Dinkelstar, beautiful name for a submarine, with boats waiting to take them ashore, courtesy of their plus ultra mole, who is revealed to be Duquesne. Shock of shocks, unless you know anything about the real Duquesne. I can't believe it's Duquesne. Now, when they're en route to the Empire State Building, Duquesne divulges Plus Ultra's 4th of July plans to the Nazis. And once they're up on the observation deck at the Empire State Building, they hack into the antenna to wirelessly access Henry's point of view camera just as he enters Worldcon. So ending out not just chapter 9, but ending out part 1, the Nazis know where Henry is. And as readers who are aware of the story, the Nazis are going to know where Lee and Clara are. So all of these separate point of view stories are converging as we head from part 1 into part 2. Hastin, this is exciting stuff. A wonderful cliffhanger. Duquesne, the mole, my mind is blown. Unless you know a little bit about Duquesne in real life, but we'll get to that. What'd you think of chapter 9?
So much more great things in here. I mean, like I said, obviously, after just coming from the Empire State Building and getting this view, it's like, what? Because I didn't even, it's been a few years since I've read the book, and I didn't even remember that there's this whole chapter that takes place there. And I just had the I was just there. I'm so glad I took these pictures moment. There's so many great quotes in this book. When they're talking with Duquesne, when Duquesne is talking with Rotwang about just what Plus Ultra is and what it's become and what they've done, there's a ton of great references to things. First of all, there's a reference when Duquesne talks about radio programs, magazines, books, a traveling exhibit, right? We've seen all those things before. Orson even got Disney to make a cartoon for them. It's all set out to roll out immediately pending the results of the dress rehearsal. Well, here we are, obviously that's coming, but I love the idea of there was a 39 version of the same cartoon that, of the same Plus Ultra cartoon that we saw in 64.
Or is it the same cartoon?
Actually, yeah, it could be the same cartoon. I never really thought about it that way. Yeah.
All Orson says at the end is, at a World's Fair just like this one.
A World's Fair just like this one.
Yeah, good point. Good point. That could have been the 39 film. Ah, that's great. The second thing that I love is Rotwang is describing to Duquesne. He's like, they'll never go through with it, meaning Plus Ultra. They'll find some excuse. Either that or bureaucracy will choke their idealism, as always. Not anymore, says Duquesne. Something more powerful now rules the day with Plus Ultra. Rotwang, what's that? And Duquesne, capitalism. Blowing smoke, trying to make the word sound filthy. The money men are itching for some yield. They have a whole business plan from toys to tourism, airports, hotels, convention centers, and my favorite line in this, a permanent World's Fair. Make people buy tickets to explore paradise and watch the smartest men in the world invent the future for them. I loved this like semi slam on Epcot Center and just like what the Walt Disney Company became and, continues to be and marches through forward. But I loved that. I loved that call out of a permanent World's Fair and just kind of, what the company became. If you think about it in the lore of Plus Ultra of, oh, it still happened. It just didn't happen in Tomorrowland. It happened here.
The best Disney stories across film and books all have some kind of subtextual dig at the Walt Disney Company. We're talking Gore Verbinski's Pirates trilogy. We're talking Tim Burton's Dumbo, which you invoked in a previous episode. Just these little digs at certain parts of Disney history, and you're totally right. This is a juicy, delicious chapter from Duquesne right here that goes into all the things that we recognize from our real world fandom transposed into this fictional secret society of geniuses. Beautiful. I was snapping the whole way through. Couldn't agree more. One other little echo that I enjoyed particularly here is when we're getting into Rotwang's head and we're seeing the conclusions that he came to about humanity. And we're realizing that, these ideas of humanity doesn't want to be saved. Plus Ultra wants to save humanity, but humanity doesn't even want to be saved, so why are we even trying? Those are the exact same conclusions that Nick's comes to in the film. So giving a different villain the same kind of ideology that will be evolved in a different way. I just love that idea because we don't actually get that much of that in the movie. So to have a book where you can say, here's a different version of that and how it can evolve over time from within Plus Ultra. Duquesne is a Plus Ultra member. Duquesne is also a couple of other things which we're going to talk about now when we get into fact versus fiction.
And how would you convince them? Data, facts. Good luck.
So Duquesne, we alluded to it before. He was all those things. What else was he in the real world? Well, he had a spy ring, but was that spy ring for the US? Sadly, no, it was a spy ring for the Nazis. So they found the safest possible historical figure that they could reveal was the mole for Plus Ultra to the Nazis. That darn Duquesne and his little twirly mustache. I just love that. I love this little detail because originally, I'm assuming the first time I read this book, I didn't even look it up. I assumed he was a fake character.
Yeah, I had never heard of Duquesne before this book either.
Glad we can spread the word and make a few more Nazis infamous in their death. It's a great time in 2025 for punching Nazis. And if we can really send folks off with a vision of what's prescient about this book, it's those darn Nazis always ruining everything. We used to all be able to agree about that. And I never thought that the villains of Before Tomorrowland would still be relevant in 2025, but life proves to be a surprising landscape at all times, doesn't it? Before we wrap up this whole part one, anything else on chapter 9, Hastin?
Well, we've got one more location station.
The hover rail will be arriving.
You already locationed that station. It's all your great photos from the Empire State Building.
Highly recommend it. Honestly, they've got a great experience if you get there. It's very well done from a tourism perspective. Maybe one of my favorite, like, I've done a lot of observation things. Just a great, there's a whole like history section with these wraparound, fully kind of, for lack of a better term, immersive walls where you can see it getting constructed around you and take pictures and whatever else. It's just really, really clever, really well done. Highly recommended when you're in New York. Fairly cheap, fairly inexpensive too. And you can go see where you can go all the way to the top and see where they found Henry and his signal.
Just fair listeners, be well behaved up there and don't hack into the antenna, because that's what Nazis do. Nazis hack antennas. Go up there and be a good tourist. The most you can do is leave a little plus ultra pin for someone to find later. That's the nice thing to do. Litter. Always litter, as long as it's a plus ultra pin. So looking back at the whole group of chapters, 9 chapters in part 1, what are some key takeaways? What are our favorite things? What are our favorite characters? I found myself really endeared to Clara. I really found myself relating to Clara. Her attitude, her rededication to being optimistic and to, even in her illness, find productive work for herself as an artist, and that willingness to be herself no matter what. I always need a little injection of that Clara energy in my life. Yes, I love all the political intrigue. I love all the spy stuff. I love all the moles and the betrayals. And Lord knows I love a little arcane plus ultra world building. But when it gets down to it, my favorite thing about the legacy of this book, especially personified in part 1, chapters 1 through 9, it's those brackets. It's that relationship. It always gets down to a relationship, whether it's Lee and Clara, Frank and Casey, or in that middle chapter, The Optimist, Amelia and her mother. There's always this relationship that is somewhat strained that needs to be reunified, some broken relationship that needs to be brought together among this landscape of futuristic thematics. It's always about the humanity. Part 1, Hastin, what did you walk away with from part 1?
I mean, I think for me, it's a lot of, feeling really bad for Henry and what he went through. Here you've got this kid that, in the prelude is just, he's excited for what his dad is working on. He's excited to become a part of this, a bit like Frank. And now he's trapped in it, figuratively, literally out for revenge because of what their technology and their, sort of, situation believed in, and how he was deceived by Rotwang and whatever else. It's hard. The whole time I'm following his memories and reading him and everything else. It's just hard not to see that sort of like disillusioned with the future adult that, like, sometimes I even find, myself sort of in the state of, especially now compared to 10 years ago when I first read it, and like what has happened societally, what has happened with, technology, and just, the trajectory that technology has gone on over the last 10 years. I mean, even just, the way that we met and what the Optimist did to bring us together from a technology perspective. I look at it now and I go, this would have been impossible. Disney could not pull off the Optimist today. I've said that many times on this podcast before. But I think what's hard is that I see my sort of brain with this, like, Henry style thing of, I kind of hate that I was introduced to, in some minor way, no offense, Nick, and no offense to our listeners, but it's like, it's frustrating that this element was ever introduced to me in the beginning, because I am constantly sinking that high that will never come again. And there's a bit of a trapped feeling, and there's a bit of a stuck feeling, and whatever else. And so, when Henry is like physically stuck in this HS1 body, and he just wants to, like, rage and say, you promised me the future and you gave me this, and I feel trapped and I feel deceived and I feel, angry. It's like, I can fully relate with that at sometimes about the trajectory of, what we got to experience, not to make this about the parks, but what the parks were and what they've become and the costs and, the nods to things and just how, there was a vision of the future. I saw it. I got to touch the pin. I got to sit in that chair and I got to experience that thing. And now it's kind of gone. And I don't mean this specific thing. I mean that vision of their future is gone. And so I can't help but feel, just as outraged.
I'm with you, and I'm so glad you brought up the Henry aspect. I think the most we can say to ourselves with our real world connections with that is ultimately it always is. It's a cliche, but it's better to have loved and lost to than never to have loved at all. And I'm with you, though. I'm so glad you brought this up because there is a lot of personal connection there. The writing of those Henry passages is so heartfelt. They went such a long way to humanize the predicament of this. This could have just been some vengeful robot that they needed to stir up drama, but they really made it this personal story, and you understand the dynamic between him and Plus Ultra, and between him and Rotwang, and him and Amelia, and you get this look through his eyes that's so revelatory and so interesting. And certainly I can personally relate. I think any of us who had an early growth spurt know what it's like to feel like a child's mind stuck in an adult body. And people treat you like an adult, even though you feel like you're still a kid. And you feel like you never really got to have the childhood that you wanted to, because as early as 12, 13, 14, you look like a full grown adult. You're the height of a full grown adult. I went to high school and the janitors mistook me for a substitute teacher. Yeah, like there's these elements of that dynamic that aren't just science fictional. It's symbolic of any kind of mind-body dissonance that occurs within our own lives, and they are many, even if it's not literally the Cartesian belief that they are separate, because everything really is connected. We know that now. But yeah, it's rich stuff, and it's really interesting to have so many layers to dig into what is ostensibly a young adult novel that's supposed to just tie into this movie. It's this tie-in book, but we've got all of these layers. And I would love to hear all the layers that we didn't even think of that were peeled back by our listeners. So if folks want to get in touch and tell us their favorite pieces from part 1, where should they send them, Hastin?
You know where to drop us a line. So we're on Blue Sky now, or we're on Instagram, or you can send us an email at press@tomorrowlandtimes.com. That's PRESS @tomorrowlandtimes.com.
And as always, we would like to thank everyone for visiting Tomorrowland Times, which we will keep alive as long as humanly possible to ensure that there is always a place where dreamers can stick together.